Hey everybody, Wayne here. In today's overview and review, we're going to take a look at Drive on Suez, Rommel Drives Deep, 1942. This is designed by Joseph Miranda, published by Decision Games in World at War number 78. This is a solitaire game where you take the role of the Panzer Army Africa, PAA, Axis, the Germans and Italians, and with Rommel not technically in charge of the whole theater, but functionally, basically the commander. And you're going to go ahead and in this game, you're starting off in Tobruk, and you are pushing your way east. Obviously, the title of the game gives it away a little bit. You are pushing your way east. Historically, Rommel was stopped at El Alamein. You see if you can go ahead and get past that. The game ends at turn 7 if you can't. If you do succeed in getting past these sort of fortress spaces and you continue on into the Nile Delta, you can go ahead and add up victory points and see where you finish. I'm going to do my usual, which is I'm going to do a full overview, and in this game, I'm actually going to cover the sequence of play. I'm going to run through the entire sequence of play, try to speed it up. It is a little bit of an extensive one, but we're going to run through pretty quick. Then I'm going to do my pros and cons. Cons first, of course, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, the game is broken up into 7 different phases, multiple sub-phases in each time. Like I said in my intro, we're going to go ahead and just run through the sequence of play. I'll kind of explain each thing as I go through it, to at least give you guys a general overview of how the game works. So, the very first phase, which you do skip on turn 1, and by the way, do not have the beginning setup on here, so if you see the map, you're like, wait a second, I actually have already, this game, it's on turn 8, so I was able to take El Alamein. My forces have pushed past. I'm threatening Alexandria, etc. But just a quick FYI in case you were looking saying, wait a second, this doesn't look right. Normally, you'd start way over here, and these would be filled with the red units, which are the Allied units. So, phase 1 is Commando Supremo phase, which you do skip on turn 1, which is you pick one Axis bulletin marker from the cup. Both sides will have bulletins. The Ally one comes later, the Axis first. Basically what they are is random events. You go ahead and you draw a random event, a chit will say a certain thing, Rommel Drives Deep, although that wouldn't be in at the very beginning because that comes later. If you've taken El Alamein, maybe it'll say something like Bastico. Go ahead and you look on the back side of the manual, and it's going to tell you the Axis bulletins and the Allied bulletins. Bastico, deploy one supply unit on any space in Libya that contains an Italian unit, and then go ahead and return that chit to the cup. You're going to do that at the beginning of every turn, starting with turn 2. The next phase is the PAA, Panzer Army Africa, which I'm going to start calling it Axis just because it's easier for me to say. It's the Axis reinforcement phase. The first sub-phase, or the first step, would be a roll on the Axis supply reinforcement table to determine the number of supply units you receive. So right over here, and some of the charts you're not going to be able to see, but this one, it is on here, I can point it out. You're going to roll on here, depending on how the air superiority looks, you'll have a die modifier, if you have Alexandria or not, etc. You go ahead and roll, it'll tell you how many supplies you're going to get, and you're going to be able to place in whatever ports you control. The supply markers are going to be very important because they're going to control your movement and combat. You can still move without them, you can still fight without being in supply, but if you are supplied, you're going to operate at basically your full movement and full strength. The second part of the reinforcement phase is you can expend what are called Desert Fox points to purchase reinforcements. I don't believe, the chart is not on the map, but basically, it's not on the camera, and that's okay. I'm not going to keep moving the camera for every little thing. You have these Desert Fox points, there's a marker, and there's a track. You start, I think it's at 24, and there's high, medium, and low. 21 through 30 is high, 11 through 20 is medium, 10 through 1 is low. And what that'll be is you spend points for reinforcements to basically get like certain supplies, extra units, etc. Get air units back. But as you're spending them, it's going down on the index. Now you're going to gain a few back as you move east and take over different allied areas, but you're not going to gain as many back as you spend. So eventually, this Desert Fox index is going to drop from high to medium to low, which is going to hurt you in other areas. This is sort of abstracted to represent, well, the Desert Fox himself, Rommel, right? His influence, his command, his ability to say, hey, send me some more units, send me some more men, send me more supplies, aircraft, etc. The next phase is the intelligence phase. This one's really quick and simple. Basically, if amongst your support units, which you'll have a holding box that has available air units and support units. There's a bunch of different types of them, and we'll kind of explain a little bit as I go here. But the one for this phase would be this type of unit that just has a plus in the bottom. That means it's an intelligence unit. That one actually even says signal on it, so it's pretty obvious, right? What that is, very simple. During this phase, you would go ahead and place it in an area where there are allied units. So say Alexandria. Say I want to know, right? Because right now, they're all hidden right now. I want to know what's there. I go ahead and place that unit there. I then roll with some modifiers. And I see, and if I roll good enough, boom, I'll be able to flip them over and start looking through and see exactly what units are there. If I don't roll very well, go ahead, discard them. At the same time, if I end up doing a combat in that phase, that spot, so say I use him, he's successful, means he remains there. I go ahead and move my units in. We start fighting in Alexandria. He will actually give a +1 during the tactical edge determination, which is something I will explain when we get into combat. Now we're going to look at the operations phase. This is easily the longest phase of the game. This is where you're going to do the majority of your actions. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first sub-phase, first thing you would do during the operations phase is the long-range bomber phase. You're doing attacks with long-range bombers. Now, you have long-range bombers, basically what you have are two different types of aircraft. There's going to be tactical bombers, or tactical fighters, which we'll get into, and these can operate we'll get into that a little bit here during combat. But during the long-range bomber phase, there's one specific thing you do. If you have long-range bombers and you want to send them on an abstracted mission to basically try to take air superiority, you're going to go ahead, you're going to assign however many you want, and each one has a strength point, as you can see. So say you assign all 4 of these. You're going to roll 4 dice. Each strength point is 1 die, and that goes for regular combat as well, as you'll see later. You're going to roll 4 dice, and you go ahead and roll on the battle results table. Battle results table, one of the areas, and it's over here. Again, I mentioned before, I'm not going to keep moving the camera around, but you're doing basically an attack against the air power index. If you roll well enough, you're going to go ahead and start moving. This says air super on it, air superiority marker. It starts off up here in the Allied. They have air superiority. If you keep sending your long-range bombers, eventually, hopefully for you, right, you're going to move it down to parity, and eventually the Axis will actually have air superiority. All right, that's the long-range bomber subphase. Now we do the ground movement subphase. Ground movement is really standard. You have units that have normal movements, and then they're moving point to point. However, the game does rely on supply, and I mentioned that before. So looking at it right now, you can see we have some combat units down here. They're all going to have, if it's motorized, there's a chart here, and you can kind of see it right here. The point is, if it's motorized and it's in supply, it can move four movement points. If it is motorized and out of supply, that movement is halved to just 2. Non-motorized, so like infantry, they can move 2 if they're in supply, 1 if they're out of supply. So that's where I was talking about earlier, where supply is important. It affects movement, it affects combat. So in this case, you're going to go ahead and move. You move units 1 at a time. There is stacking. It just depends on the it depends on the space, and that depends on the size of your units. We're not going to get deep into that. But basically, standard movement, you're moving along. You have roads here. You have tracks. There's desert down here. Only recon units can move along the desert. So you have to be careful as you're moving, and always keeping in mind whether units are supplied or not. And of course, there's things like administrative move, right? Which is where if you're not moving into a hex with an enemy, a space with an enemy, then you can go ahead and you can move a little bit extra that turn. All right, let's go to the allied reaction subphase. So you've done movement. Now, something that's kind of unique to this game, at least as far as I'm aware, is say you're moving into any space that the allies hold. So say we had never taken El Alamein. Now there would be units there already, already be allied units there. But say we're moving our forces into that space. As soon as we entered it, we would make what's called a reaction check. So we'd check the type of terrain it is, and there's a terrain effects chart up here on the map. In this case, El Alamein is a allied fortress. If you look under allied reaction rating, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everything's on a 1d6, by the way. So what that would mean is you roll a 1d6, and if you get a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, you're going to end up drawing allied units from this cup, this regroup cup, MEC, Middle Eastern Command, but we'll just call them allied. You're going to draw units from that equal to whatever you rolled. So again, if it's 1 through, say it's only 1 through 2, so say you enter an open space, and if that was Allied controlled, you'd roll a 1d6. If you rolled a 1 or 2, whatever you rolled would be that many Allied units you'd go ahead and draw and place. If you rolled a 3 or higher, none would get drawn or placed. Next after that subphase is the combat subphase. So this obviously kind of ties in. So you do your movement, you have the ally reaction, so they may be extra units that suddenly appear wherever you ended up. Now it's time to fight. Combat, I'm just go ahead and just go down through combat and tell you how combat works. Starting at the very beginning, it's called tactical deployment. Whatever you're in, you go ahead and reveal all the allied units. So say we're moving into Alexandria and attacking, you would go ahead, and if we hadn't already done, intelligence to figure out what's there, we'd go ahead and line them up, and you line them up from strongest to weakest. So say left to right, strongest to weakest. And then whatever your units are, you can go ahead and line them up however you want. So say we want to put a Panzer first, this mechanized, and then maybe Panzers here. That's a tactical deployment. Then you do any Axis airstrike or support unit fires. So I had mentioned before there are tactical aircraft, which technically you can use the long-range bombers for this, although obviously remember they only have 1 die, so they're not quite as effective. But you have tactical fighters or tactical aircraft. You see a 2, they're all a 2. Go ahead and commit as many as you want, as long as they're within range of an airfield, which, unfortunately for us, in this case, El Alamein, assuming we hadn't captured Amaria, which we already did, because in my game, like you said, we're farther along. There's an airfield here. They have a range of 2. So as long as they're within 2 locations of airfield, you go ahead and use up to 4 tactical fighters. You go ahead and assign them. You go ahead and roll on them, just like we would before with the long-range bombers, right? So for every strength point, so in this case 2, you can roll 2 dice. Go ahead and check the battle results table, resolve it. Eliminations, retreats, etc. At the same time, you can assign support. Support is a big part of this game. Support, you're going to have support available. So there's a box that has available air, which is the tactical fighters and our bombers. And then there also is support. Those are going to be things like artillery, extra Panzer tank units. In this case, something you can only use on when you're being attacked, which when the allies are attacking during their counterattack subphase, and that's 3 dice. The D basically means that it can only be used when you're being attacked, etc. Right? So there's different support that you may use, and now when you use them, they're kind of used up. You get aircraft back automatically, but if you use these types of support, these other support, non-aircraft support, you actually have to basically buy them back using your Desert Fox points later on. So it's kind of, you got to be careful when you're assigning them. Okay, so we do our support. We, roll for our aircraft attacking. We roll for our support, whatever's left. Say we've eliminated 1 of them. Okay, there's still these allied units here. No problem there. Now we go on to the tactical edge determination. This is where, remember when I talked about that signal unit adds a +1 to your intelligence? Well, that would be this. So you go ahead and just do a roll off. Where the die is, there it is. So you go ahead and you're just going to be rolling with some modifiers. Is Rommel being committed to the battle? Do you, as the Axis, have Panzers involved? Do the Allies have tanks? Do they have, is the terrain advantageous to them? Alexandria, El Alamein, you can see this is a fortress. El Alamein, is a fortress. Therefore, it's going to be a +1 to them in their roll. You can go ahead and roll. Whoever gets higher is going to have a tactical edge, which all that means is they get to go first. So say we've determined who goes first. Say it's us as the Axis. You can see our Panzer here has a 4. Whoop, the guy that I just threw, apparently. Didn't have a 4 anymore. All right, so he has a 4. So you would roll 4 dice. You guessed it. So go ahead and roll our 4 dice. Check our battle results table. If there are any allied units left, their next guy would go, and then it goes back and forth until combat is all the way resolved. That is the combat subphase in a nutshell. You have things like who has to retreat. If you basically go 1 round each, so everyone gets to fire once. If there's units left, they're going to stay in that same spot, and they're going to have another combat here in a little bit during the Allied MEC phase, which is coming up next. All right, I did say the Allied MEC phase is coming up next. That is wrong. It's actually the logistics phase technically comes next. What that is, pretty simple. Has two little subphases, two actions. You can flip any of your truck units over to make a supply depot. Difference is a truck can be used to supply all the units in one location. If you flip it over to a supply depot, it can supply everything in the same space or adjacent. And then you will go ahead and you can spend supply. So instead of using it at all, I could maybe say, all right, I'm going to spend this, throw it off the map. I can take two air units that maybe were damaged that are in the refit display, and I can add them back into my available air and support. That way I can keep using them. You also can lose aircraft during fights. If they roll a 1 during their attacking, they will suffer a loss, and they'll basically have to go to the refit box. That does not happen to your ground forces, excuse me. They, even if you roll a 1, just basically means no effect. All right, we're going to run through the Allied MEC phase and all the subphases in one go here, just so we can get on to the rest of the review. We've already kind of covered most of it anyway. So first subphase is the Allied Bulletin subphase, which, just like the Axis, you have basically these random events you're going to draw. Go ahead and draw and enact that. You're going to have an Allied Air subphase. Very simple. There is a chart for Allied air attacks. Again, I realize it is off the camera. That's okay. Basically, based on... so you're rolling a 1d6, and then with modifiers based on where the air superiority is, right? If the Allies have it, if it's parity, or if the Axis have it. Put that modifier on a roll. You're going to roll against the Axis air units, depending on if you roll, and lower is bad for you as the Axis player. If it's low, you're going to suffer losses to your air units. They're going to go into that the refit display, and you can't use them until you spend them back or buy them back with supply. You're going to roll against your supply units. Again, low is bad. If you roll low, you're going to have to discard supply units. That shows that the Allies have been attacking your supply lines. And then finally, Axis combat and support units. Again, if you roll low, that's bad. You're going to go ahead and have to actually take losses against your units, flip them over, whichever unit you choose to. So that's the air subphase. Now the Allied counterattack subphase. Really what this is that any of the locations where you still had units, so I'd mentioned like if we were fighting over El Alamein, and if we both still had units after combat, right? So we finished up our combat, and now there was still our units sharing the same space. We go ahead and have combat with them as the attacker. Doesn't really change anything other than a couple different things. Like I mentioned, you can use that one support, the artillery, on the defensive. You cannot use it on the offensive. So, all right, after that is the Allied replacement subphase. So basically what had happened is while you're playing, and every time you get an elimination result on an Allied unit here, it goes in a temporarily eliminated box. You go ahead and gather up all the units out of that box, and you're rolling a chart. And again, based on air superiority, which is why that's actually really important to the game, you're going to go ahead and roll, and they may go back into the regroup box or regroup cup. They may stay in the temporary eliminated box for you to roll on next turn, or they may be permanently eliminated. The ones that are permanently eliminated are going to going to count for you when it comes to adding up victory points at the end of the game. Whew. All right, that is the Allied MEC phase. All right, now let's get into the end of turn phase. So super simple. The administrative subphase, basically all your units that you had used, so not the ones that are in the refit box, but the ones you had used to conduct long-range bombing, during combat, etc. They go back into your available air and support box. And then you check for victory. There's victory conditions. We talked about this a little bit earlier. End of turn Alamein check. If you haven't taken El Alamein and the other two fortress spots, so all three of these, by the end of turn 7, the game ends and you go ahead and add up victory points. If you make it through, if you've captured them, the game is going to continue on a full 10 turns. That is my overview. Hopefully that gave you guys a good idea of how the game works. Like I said, I mean, it's pretty quick and dirty. We didn't play through it, but I ran through the whole sequence of play, baby. There's a lot of phases, sub-phases, but that gives you an idea of how it works, running through. Just imagine each thing being expanded, right? I talked about movement super quick. Well, obviously you're going to spend time on deciding, you use supply, where you're going to be moving your units. You're going to be trying to kind of go through the desert with some of your recon units. Are you going to say, forget that, I'm just going to attack, frontal attack? Are you saving your aircraft, or when are you using them, etc.? There's a lot to those different phases. I just ran through them quick so you guys can see them in action. So let's go ahead and go on to my pros and cons. All right, time for my pros and cons. As usual, we'll start with my cons first. The map. It's definitely function over form, right? So looking at it, the map where your units are, so this sort of bottom half, less than half, is not that bad, actually. I mean, you have some artwork here behind the areas, everything. The terrain's very clear, right? Because you have boxes, you have triangles, you have the pentagon symbols, and you're going to have your terrain key. So you can see exactly what each you have no question about that, right? There's no question about what the terrain is. You know, where the harbors are, you know, major harbors, minor harbors, where the airfields are, etc. Obviously, and you guys can see some of them, the charts, I mean, they're kind of just there, right? They're not necessarily in an order. They're kind of where it seems like maybe where they would fit. I understand that, but yeah, you know, when you look at the map, you look at the whole display, right? It's not just the play area display, but the whole map, and you're kind of standing back looking at it. Yeah, nothing fancy. It's not really going to catch your eye. Supply. So I'm putting in the con is how supply is used take getting used to. What I mean by that is when to apply it, how long it lasts. There's actually a supply unit expenditure chart which helps you with that. Because, for instance, the game will say, in the rules it says, hey, you can use supply, it lasts for, say, an entire phase. Well, the rulebook listed, say, operations phase, which I just went through, right? That's long-range bomber, ground movement, allied reaction, and combat. Those are all sub-phases within the operations phase. Well, in reality, as you can see on the chart here, you may not be able to see it, but it is here, it's listed, actually, supply will only last through the movement sub-phase. You then need to use another supply during combat or the allied counterattack. So see how it's a little trickier. It's like, wait a second. Oh, the supplies don't last quite as long as you may think based on the rules. Something to get used to is really how they function and how they work. The reason I say like that is because of the fact that most war games, right, you trace supply. Supply comes from this port. You trace it, you're done. Done. Well, in this one, I mean, you have supply moving with you in truck form. You may turn them into depots, you may not. They have to be with you to use them, or again, they could be a depot if they're adjacent, but you're keeping track of them, you're moving them with you. It's a little different than the majority of games that deal with supply. And finally, for my cons, and this is kind of a funny one, what is the name of the game anyway? So the map says Drive on Suez, Rommel Drives Deep, 1942. The front of the magazine says Drive on Suez, and then if you go on Board Game Geek, it says Suez Solo, Rommel Drives Deep. So it's like all these variations on, you know, we get the idea, right? Drive on Suez, whatever. We get the idea. But it's just a little funny to me that there's kind of 3 different places it's like listed as different names, 3 different names. So anyway, doesn't really matter, but just thought I'd mention it. All right, on to the pros. First one, counter size, both size and thickness. So the counters are very nice. They're a good size, 5/8, I believe. And then they also are very thick. They're a nice, thick counter. These aren't these little, like, white, thin ones. These are actually, like, brown cardboard where they're, like, thicker. Very nice, very thick. And mine punched out super well. Normally, I would clip this type of counter type game with these little counters. But, first of all, it's not hexes, so they don't have to be as close. But secondly, I mean, they punched out super well. There's barely any, like, extra tufts on the end, anything like that. So I didn't even have to clip them. I just used them. So good job on the counters. Very little errata. So I mentioned a couple of it, right? Like the supply units, kind of there's a little bit of the rule book compared to the board is a little different maybe. I've seen some references to some things where different places of the rule book, the same term will be used differently. You see PAA, then you see Axis, then PAA Axis, and then, you know, just a few different things. But not that much. Let's be perfectly honest, magazine war games are known for often, not always, but often having a lot of errata. This game does not, which is very nice, and I really appreciate that. Next one, limited supply. It's actually fun because it makes you plan out your movement and combat. You never have enough supplies to do everything you want to. Now, in solitaire games, a lot of times, it just feels like there's some other constraints, limited amount of actions per turn, etc. Well, in this one, you can do whatever you want. You know, you can move your units however you want, whatever. You can move them out of supply. If you want, you can attack out of supply, but they're going to be weaker. So if you're relying on supply to make sure you get the most bang for your buck, right, it's going to be something you're going to have to manage. And it really brings a little bit of strategy to the game, actually a lot of strategy, because also your supplies, they don't just appear next to you. They're going in these ports, and there's air supply as well, but it's much more limited. But for the most part, they're appearing, these structures appearing, and they got to go all the way east through the desert here, basically, to get to you, just like it was historically. And finally, the reaction mechanic and the counteroffensive random events give the game a direct response to your actions, not just random placement of the enemies. What I mean by that is I talk about it a little bit during the allied reaction subphase. So wherever your units are moving to, you're rolling to see if allied units are going to pop up. They may not. And even if there are already allied units somewhere, you're still going to roll, and they may get basically reinforced. I think it's a really clever mechanic that adjusts to the player's actions, right? It's not just an AI that's you roll a die and that's it. It's actually saying where you're going, this AI, right, the allies are going to possibly, and not always, possibly react to your movements of combat units, which I think is really clever. And then the counteroffensive. So during the bulletin phase, they can actual counteroffensives. That's a little more strict in that generally it targets the most northern and most eastern units, which will usually be your primary drive on, say, El Alamein and Alexandria. But again, it's cool that it's kind of randomized and that you never know that suddenly, allies are launching the counteroffensive. You may have strung yourself out a little bit fighting. You may have done some pursuit, all kinds of stuff, and next thing you know, they're attacking you back, and you may not be ready. You may not be supplied anymore, and now your units are fighting at reduced strength. So those are my pros and cons. Let's go ahead. I'll give you my final thoughts in a second. All right, guys, final thoughts. I really like this game. I do think that with some work on kind of the map and the way the charts and tables are laid out, I think this could basically, this could be a box game. There's enough gameplay here. There's enough of an interesting design. I feel like if they just, and I believe the map is Joe Used. I've seen him do some great looking maps with good charts. Everything flows well, etc. I understand that as a magazine game, they're, a little more of a deadline thing, right, I believe, and they kind of have to, yep, this works. And it does work. But honestly, if they kind of beefed it up a little bit, I think it could be a box game they could re-release, like a deluxe version of it. Overall, like I said, I really like it. I'm going to recommend this one if you want a solitaire design war game that incorporates some of the unique aspects of the North African campaign, specifically the extended supply lines and allies that are defending and that are concentrating their forces as time goes by. These are things that are simulating in a solitaire game, which sometimes can be hard. Doing a good job, I think, of simulating the actual North African campaign, which was a lot of fast movement, some battles, and then moving and kind of traveling long distances and extended supply lines and not having enough, fuel and munitions. And no, that isn't, you don't keep track of fuel and munitions, but you do keep track of supply. You do have these trucks rumbling across the desert trying to get to the front. And the farther away you get from Tobruk and the farther away you get from your main port, it's going to be harder and harder to keep up your offensives. And next thing you know, the Allies, as they get stronger, right, they're having reactions. More forces are building up in these areas. They're going to be it's that much tougher of a nut for you to crack. So, all right, I hope you guys enjoyed this overview and review. Hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at this game. If you did, please comment below. Give me a thumbs up if you liked the video. Let me know if you played this game, what you think of it. Also, if you're not subscribed and you've made it all this way, please subscribe. I really would appreciate it. And if you want to support the channel directly, I have a Patreon. You can go ahead and sign up. The link is below. It'll be in the video description and comments. And we're going to do a game giveaway coming up here soon, and we're going to keep doing them in the future as well, because I have a lot of good games that I think we can find a lot of good homes for. So, all right. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Till next time, everyone. Later.